Hello, everyone. Good morning in some parts of the world, good evening in others, and good afternoon in yet others. Welcome to today's event hosted by the India Center at UCF, and welcome to Dr. Raji Rajagopalan from the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology in New Delhi, and Brendan Byrne from WMFE for a discussion on India's space policy. I'm Dr. Kerstin Hammann. I'm the interim director of the India Center at UCF and a Pegasus professor in the School of Politics, Security and International Affairs. The India Center at UCF broadens the understanding and awareness of contemporary India and promotes the study of India in the world today and the relationship between the United States and India through partnerships, scholarship and research, education and outreach. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us for this event. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Laila Chakko, the Director of Public Affairs of the India Center, who will introduce our guests. I look forward to a spirited discussion and I hope you will enjoy the event. Laila?
Thank you, Kirsten. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speakers today. Before I introduce them, I would like to announce that today's session is being recorded and will be on our website. Brendan Byrne is going to be moderating today's discussion. Brendan is a reporter for WMFE, Central Florida's NPR station. He covers the space industry from civilian science missions to commercial aerospace development. He's the host of a weekly show called Are We There Yet? He's also a graduate of UCF's School of Politics, Security and International Affairs. And Dr. Rajeswari Rajagopalan is the director for the Center of Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. Dr. Rajagopalan is a senior Asia defense writer for The Diplomat, writing a weekly column on Asian strategic issues. When UCF was originally founded, its mission was to educate students for space-age careers in engineering and other technological professions. So space has been a part of UCF's history from the inception. Space policy is a natural discussion with all the recent developments in the space industry, and space policy is essential for a sustainable space future. Now I'll hand it over to Brendan to start our discussion.
Well, thank you, Laila, and a huge thank you to the India Center at UCF for facilitating this important and timely discussion. And I have to take every opportunity to say, go Knights, class of 2013. So thank you very much for having me. This is a super timely conversation, as Laila mentioned. So we are going to be taking questions throughout the discussion and towards the end of this program. So please utilize the Q&A function in the chat. And Dr. Rajagopalan, thank you so much for joining us this evening, your time.
Thank you so much for having me here. This is, of course, a great time to discuss the space policy issues. And there have been a lot of important developments in recent times, of course.
Absolutely. So let's talk about broadly, the Indian Space Research Organization is India's civilian space agency. Some news coming out of there this year. There's a new leader who vowed to focus the program on human space exploration. But before we dig into this international collaboration, let's talk a little bit about India's civilian space program. What are some of its highlights? Tell us a bit about the agency, Raji.
Yeah, sure. Let's start off on that. I think that's so the India decided to go into space, even though right after the independence, we were a pretty poor, very developing country with a lot of developmental challenges, economy in bad shape, and so on and so forth. But I think India's leaders, both Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, who's considered as the space India's father of this Indian space program, as well as the political leadership, India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, both of them understood the role of important key technologies such as space capabilities and technologies, what that can do to change the lives of the people. And therefore, India began to focus on its space program from early 1960s onwards. ISRO, in its current form, the Indian Space Research Organization, which is the Civil Space Organization of India, came together in its current form in 1969. Since then, but of course, clearly interplanetary missions such as the mission to Mars, the Mangalyaan mission, or lunar missions like Chandrayaan, they were not part of the original goals for the new space program. But I think, like I said, the leadership of the country clearly understood the importance of technology for development, but also the significance of technology demonstration that could ensure India a seat at the certain exclusive high-tech clubs, so to say, which also became an important driver of India's space program. But I think for a country that just began a space program, the main focus was on effective communication within the country. India being a vast geography, developing effective communication was an important requirement, which pushed ISRO to initially focus on its communication satellites. Second major area of focus was the Earth observation satellites. A third area from the early 70s was the satellite launch vehicle. So India went about with the first satellite launch vehicle. First successful test was in 1980. Since then, SLV program matured to something called the PSLV. We also had a couple of other programs in between, but PSLV, the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, has become ISRO's tried and tested workhorse in a sense, and that has been doing fairly well in terms of even the capturing the commercial, global commercial market, being India able to launch smaller payloads for a number of different countries and other entities in a sense. So I think this was the major idea behind the Indian space program. But in recent times, there have been a lot of other drivers that have come to become much more prominent, particularly the security requirements. I'm sure we'll come to it in a bit of time.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about those long-term goals of the Indian Space Agency. You mentioned kind of the foundational goals to, kind of provide some space-based assets to the civilians down on Earth, to do some Earth observation as well. But moving forward, what are kind of what's the long-term goals for the civilian space agency?
So that's also in a sense, now that India has been in the space business from the 1960s, India's program has matured to certain levels. So like I said in the beginning, initially Chandrayaan, the lunar missions and Mars missions were not part of it. Human space flight, a crewed mission was again not part of the original thinking when India started the space program. But as India's space program has matured, but also given the kind of changes that we see in the regional dynamics and also in the global scheme of things, India has begun to feel the need to develop its own kind of space proficiency, going beyond just the immediate requirement of reconnaissance and communication satellites and so on and so forth. So India is now planning to have its first human space mission early next year. This was, of course, a political objective that was set out by Prime Minister Modi a few years ago during his Independence Day speech. So the timeline is a bit too short, and we were supposed to have originally launched the mission this year. But given the impact of the COVID and kind of thing, we have pushed it to next year. But that is something that's going to happen in the immediate next year, actually. India is also planning a mission to Venus, an upcoming second mission to Mars, missions to study the sun in a lot more detail. So I think there are a few other important missions that are being planned, some on its own and some in partnership with France and other countries. There is also, for instance, the Mars mission, the second Mars mission is also being consulted with the US Space Agency, NASA. So there is an India-US Mars working group in play out there. So there are some of these programs are going to come up in an independent manner, but some are going to be done with other partners, given that these are also costly, expensive missions, complex missions. And some of the Indian capabilities, especially for deep space missions and kind of things, India is still developing, maturing its capabilities. So India prefers to work with other partner countries, like-minded partners, such as the US or France, a lot more over the years, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk a bit about that. That international collaboration in a moment, but I just want to get a sense from, on the ground from the people of India, is there support for a space program? We talk about, University of Central Florida being developed because of a growing space program here. Anyone from Florida knows that, space is in our DNA, but is there a lot of public support from the citizens over there?
Yeah, I think the Indian space program is one of the, ISRO, for instance, the Indian Space Research Organization, is one of the rare public sector units, institutions that has done India pretty well. India has been able to achieve a lot with a really small budget in a sense. So with a fraction of the budget, the achievements of the ISRO has been fairly good. It's done India a lot proud, actually. So there is a lot of public support. So if you look at the second moon mission that India was attempting in 2019, India did attempt that mission, but India did not land on the moon. India had a soft landing. It was planning on a soft landing, but did have a hard landing on the moon, on the surface.
Wasn't soft enough.
Exactly. But the fact is that you could see the kind of public support for this particular mission. And I think there are a couple of different reasons why we do this mission. One is, of course, to get the next generation of youngsters interested in space in particular, but also broadly the STEM education. So there's a lot of emphasis in that sense. But I think given the achievements of ISRO, the Mars mission being achieved in 2014, in India's first attempt, that was also a major highlight of Indian space program. So that the fact that India has been able to achieve a lot with a very small budget has appealed to the larger public, and there is a lot of public support for India's space program.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about international collaboration, especially with the United States. A very interesting mission happening soon is a joint mission between NASA and the Indian Space Agency, set to launch next year, aimed at tracking Earth's changing climate. Talk a bit about how this remote sensing mission and the relationship between the United States and India came to be.
So the US has remained one of India's oldest partners, even though we had a bit of a break in between following 1974, India's first peaceful nuclear explosion. But I think a serious halt came about when India conducted went overtly with its nuclear weapons program in 1998 with the Pokhran test. So it did give a break, but otherwise some of the earliest partners in India's space program are the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, now Russia has become a much slower partner, much more. We do collaborate with them on certain technologies and certain aspects of our space program, but Russia has become a much smaller component when you look at the overall space partners that India has today. India's closest partners today, active partners, I would say, are the US and France. With France, again, we have a long history and uninterrupted history of space collaboration starting from 1960s onwards. But with the US, I think there are a whole number of areas which we have been working together. And there has been a joint working group, a civil space working group that has been in place for about a decade plus now. And I think, that's been on an ongoing process. But I think some of the more exciting things to me that has come about in recent times, for instance, when India undertook the first Chandrayaan mission, the Luna mission, the assistance that came from NASA, and I think that was something that was very, very critical. Mars mission collaboration, that was again very significant. The Mars working group, I think that given the success of India's Mangalyaan mission and NASA's own Mars mission, the MAVEN, the two agencies have looked at now collaborating, exploring additional areas related to Mars exploration. I think both countries have had several meetings over the last few years now. And so that's something that is likely to mature. But something more striking to me has been the space security dialogue that has been set up between India and US. And the US is the first country with which India started a space security dialogue. And when it comes to security, India remains extremely sensitive. We talk to everybody. We are open to talking to everybody when it comes to civil space or civil nuclear and kind of thing. But anything to do with security, India is extremely wary of that. But the fact is that in 2015, we started the India-US Space Security Dialogue, which is the first of its kind that India has had. And in 2018, then thereafter, we went on to start a similar space security dialogue with Japan, and last year with France. So that shows the kind of limited number of countries with whom India is engaged in a space security conversation, which is becoming more prominent in recent times. But let me also just touch upon the NASA ISRO project, the NISAR. NISAR is an important mission that is being planned for sometime next year. I think this has been a truly collaborative venture between the NASA and the ISRO. NASA, ISRO, Synthetic Aperture Radar, the NISAR. So both of them are looking at this particular satellite to study climate change, natural disasters by calculating changes on Earth's surface, such as variations in land vegetation, ice sheets, and so on and so forth. And I think ISRO has been somewhat comfortable with working with France over the years, but I think this is a truly collaborative mission where both ISRO and NASA have had some an equal share in planning and sort of making progress on this particular mission. So this is something that's seen as fairly important. One other mission is the aid in navigation. On the navigation side, the Gagan mission, Gagan system has been developed essentially by the ISRO and the Airports Authority of India as a satellite-based augmentation system for the Indian airspace in a sense. This again has been something that India has worked with, not just the civil space agency on the other side, but also with Raytheon and a couple of other companies that have also been part of the India's Gagan mission in a sense. So overall, when I look at it, I think India's comfort level working with the United States has become a lot more, lot better. And more recently, I think the last year, the Quad Leaders Summit, for instance, also highlighted the manner in which India, US, can work with some of the other like-minded partners, especially the Quad partners, bringing in Australia and Japan as well. To work on a range of issues, including consultations on space governance, global governance aspects also. So I think those are some important changes that I see from the Indian side, especially as we look at closer collaboration between India and US.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a mission launching hopefully next year, a satellite that will help track the changing climate here on Earth. I'm wondering if it's these kind of big questions or big global issues like climate change that are really driving this collaboration, right? This is something that's going to impact everyone on this planet. Is that why the Indian Civilian Space Agency is jumping in on this collaboration?
Yeah, I think this was the study that was already this was a project that already the NASA was kind of taking the lead on, and ISRO found it useful to partner with the NASA to kind of study, because climate change is a global issue. And this is something that has found some sort of an appeal among the larger public as well in spending India's money on some of the useful programs like that one that could track climate change and environmental degradation and so on and so forth. So India also partnered on such somewhat similar missions with France, for instance, a couple of years ago in launching a few satellites. And so I think I think this is something, it's a common challenge, it's a global challenge, and no one country can target, develop the means to track and to deal with such kind of disasters. So in a sense, it found certain amount of appeal within the Indian Space Research Organization, as well as the broader Indian policy community, to partner with NASA on this particular program.
Mm-hmm. You made mention of the historical relationship between India and the Soviet Union and then Russia. We're going to take a question from one of our attendees here who asked, do you expect the ISRO-Roscosmos cooperation in human spaceflight to continue at the same pace as it's been in the past few years? You mentioned that that relationship was waning a bit. Do you expect that to continue to wane or even accelerate into a non-relationship in the future based upon kind of what's happening now here on Earth?
Yes, I think it could run into a bit of a problem. Already there has been a bit of slowing down when it comes to India-Russia space cooperation. For instance, just to give you a quick example, in 2008, India did the first lunar mission, and India was planning a subsequent follow-on mission in 2011, and India was dependent on Russia for supplying the lander for that particular mission, and to be for several years, Russia kept delaying, saying that it is just a matter of delay. It's going to be supplying that lander to India. But finally, sometime around, I think, mid 2010s, I think sometime in 2015, around there, Russia walked out of that particular arrangement and told India that it cannot be, it's not in a position to supply India with the lander for the Chandrayaan-2 mission. And I believe there was a China factor that came into play that made Russia stop that particular engagement with India. But given, and thereafter, India, of course, went on to develop the lander as well as a rover it was already developing. But given today's current situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Indian position has been so far one of abstention when it comes to the votes. India has not voted against Russia, but even then, India is further supplying, sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine, has taken a number of, and further, the explanation of the Indian abstention by the Indian ambassador in New York does suggest it's pretty harsh, pretty critical of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, calling upon the respect for international law, respect for UN Charter, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure that Russia is happy with the Indian abstention, although it has also angered its a number of India's new security partners who are all united when it comes to calling out the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I would think that India-Russia relations are going to be going through a patch of difficult time, and that would also mean that India's missions, wherein there is a Russian component, that could be further delayed. The upcoming Gaganyaan, or the human space mission flight, is going to happen. It's supposed to be happening next year, and the astronauts were trained in Russia during the COVID years, and already because of the COVID, there has been some bit of the delay. But given the current tensions, that astronaut training is over and they're back, and I hope that particular the current tensions don't affect the human space flight mission. But I think going forward, I think there are going to be difficulties in India's Russia space cooperation agenda.
Mm-hmm. And that human space flight is on a Russian Soyuz, correct?
Yes. So again, that could bring about some sort of a problem in a sense. Absolutely. No, we are not doing it at the. No, my apologies. We are doing it at one of our own missions in a sense. No, we are not using.
But they're training. They're training, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Like okay, yeah.
They did the training there. Absolutely.
Yes, gotcha. Let's turn back to the U.S. here. NASA is working with its international partners to return to the moon. This is the Artemis program that's quite ambitious. It's aims to seek humans, send them back to the moon, and establish a permanent scientific presence both on the lunar surface and in space. And it's collecting, partnerships with other countries, at least a dozen at this point. What is the prospect of India joining the U.S. In this Artemis mission?
Yeah, I wish I had a very clear answer in terms of how India would, in the Indian establishment, would respond to this. Artemis Accords is a good one, one that reiterates many of the principles that are already contained in the international space regime, including the Outer Space Treaty that talks about peaceful exploration, transparency, interoperability, emergency assistance, registration of objects, and so on and so forth, and preserving the outer space heritage, preventing harmful interference, safe disposal of space debris. So there are a number of important principles that are already contained in the Outer Space Treaty, as well as other subsidiary agreements that are contained in the Artemis Accord. So it's a good place. It's a good measure in terms of strengthening lunar cooperation, lunar mission exploration. But having said that, I think India may not immediately come on board for a couple of different reasons. I think one of the serious problems faced now by India is that Artemis Accords is not the only one that is out there in terms of lunar governance, lunar missions. There is also the China and Russia have proposed to build an international lunar research station. And the two countries are also seeking other countries and international organizations to join their endeavor. But again, this may not be very, very fruitful from the Indian side. I'm not sure, despite the fact that Roscosmos as well as the Chinese Space Agency have really called out to a lot of number of different countries to join their program. I'm not sure as to what kind of support base that Russia and China will get, but it is quite evident that even with regard to lunar activities and governance proposals, the global community is going to be divided. I think, and the countries that might take a position at the end of the day, either to join the Artemis Accords or the ILRS, are going to be based on their political leanings far more than merits of each proposal, in a sense. And in this context, I think it makes difficult in some ways for countries like India to become part of the one or the other, because Russia, on the one hand, old historical partner, although with a lot of current baggage in a sense, might want India to join the ILRS project. But I think there is also the adversarial nature of relations between India and China that will come into play, that because that is going to prevent any meaningful cooperation between the two countries in outer space, and that could also make India wary of the China-Russia proposal. But I think a more pertinent reason as to why India has not possibly shown any great enthusiasm towards the Artemis Accords is because this is a more of a unilateral initiative or a state particular initiative. It's not a multilateral proposal. And I think that may be the primary reason as to why India is not showing any particular position towards the Artemis Accords. So if the US had proposed this through a multilateral platform, maybe it would have had a different response from a number of countries like India that traditionally has wanted these kind of governance measures come up through UN and such other platforms. So I think that could be an area that India might be slightly wary of, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But like I said, the Quad, for instance, beginning to talk about governance measures is an important change as far as India's response is concerned, because India traditionally stayed with G21 countries, the group of 21 countries that typically are the non-alignment movement countries. So in a sense, moving away from, and that group insisted on legally binding verifiable measures and so on and so forth. So from there to come to this distance to put in a Quad joint statement that talks about prior consultations on space governance, I think that's a huge shift that we're already seeing in India. But I think the shift is not yet complete or asset, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Sticking with the moon, we're going to take another question from one of our participants. Human exploration, they ask, human exploration of the moon is being left more and more to robots. Do you think India will continue its robotic exploration of the moon or focus on human missions?
I think this is something that India is planning, at least in the initial stages. India's plan is to get the robotics side of things done before it starts sending humans to moon, in a sense. So that's a step two, but the first step is to follow through robotic missions before India can, because it's also somewhat more complex, and therefore India has to develop its more sophisticated capabilities before it can send. It is ready to send humans to moon, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And Raji, maybe I should have asked this question before we start talking about international collaboration, but I mean, broadly, why is international partnerships between these civilian space agencies so important? Why can't a country like India just go at these ambitious missions alone? Why is international collaboration so important?
I think a couple of different issues are there. One is the major aspect of international collaboration comes from the fact that space missions are costly, expensive missions. They have a financial burden, in a sense, that is imposed on the state. And for a developing country such as India that has a fairly small budget allocated for its space program, a partnership with other countries always makes sense, and partnership with like-minded countries, which also sort of furthers international kind of collaboration a lot more easier, and it's easier to work with other countries that also has the technological capabilities. India has developed a lot of technology indigenously, but at the same time, partnering with other countries can ease some of the delays, can work in when it comes to some of the delays that India might face otherwise. So one is a technological advantage that it might gain through international partnership. Second is, of course, the budgetary constraints that have always remained a concern for countries, for a developing country like India, that has a very small budget for its space program. And third, I think countries like India are also trying to expand the number of countries that we work with, because it also is becoming a tool. Space is also becoming part of the diplomacy in a sense. So if you're able to further your national interest through such collaborations, at least over the last decade, this is something that is much more pronounced in India's space program, in India's overall diplomacy, I must say. Prime Minister Modi, for instance, for the first time talked about a South Asian satellite. So doing something for the smaller countries in South Asian region, because these are small developing countries, and India as an established space player should be able to do something that will also further India's own national interest. It's part of the soft power sort of that India can further in its neighborhood. But I think going beyond the neighborhood, India is also working with a number of ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Singapore, and so on and so forth. So this is also becoming, in some sense, in India's partnership or China's new partners in the space domain, all of them are also driven by a certain amount of geopolitical interest in a sense, increasingly. So that's becoming a sort of a dominant aspect of collaborations.
Let's turn towards the private sector, Raji. For us here in Florida, we can see that there is a growing private sector here in the US. There's multiple launches, at least once a week at this point, it seems like, here in Florida. But kind of tell us about the prospects of the private sector, the private aerospace sector in India.
So India's space program has been almost completely a state-driven program. So the Indian Space Research Organization has been the driver, developer of the Indian space program. But I think the Indian space program is, in a sense, maturing in a way where it's also being demonstrated through its growing private sector participation in the country. This is, of course, nothing comparable to the kind of private sector participation and initiatives that can be found in the US or even in China. China has also embraced private sector participation very effectively over the last few years. Nevertheless, I think there are at least now a dozen private sector startup companies, especially in southern Indian cities of Bangalore and Hyderabad, that are becoming prominent in their ability to service various requirements from the ISRO. But I am slightly uncomfortable with the fact that the ISRO is still resistant to the idea of embracing the private sector, because ISRO does enjoy a certain amount of monopoly, and it does not want to share the space with other competitors who might be able to do even a more cost-effective mission, for instance, or in a very accelerated pace. They may be able to develop things so ISRO is in a sense somewhat grudgingly and out of compulsions, it's kind of opening the doors to the private sector so that they can also contribute to. So ISRO's approach currently is one of not that of a facilitator, it's still a gatekeeper. It does not want to open the doors widely so that everybody enters the private sector. The private sector is kind of has a level playing field when it comes to India's space program. But the Indian government seems to be quite keen to open up the private sector in a big way for a number of different reasons. One is India's own demands on space sector has grown enormously, whether it is for communications, whether it is for reconnaissance, intelligence, or the military security requirements. All of these demands are growing up, but the ISRO is not entirely able to keep up with the growing demand. So therefore, the growing domestic demand on the space technology, space capabilities is a major factor. Second major factor that is driving India to embrace private sector in a limited fashion is to look at the global commercial space market. If India has to be able to cash in on the global commercial market, space market. It has to step up its competitiveness. It has to better improve its capabilities, the launch competitiveness, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of different, at least a couple of different drivers pushing India to kind of open up the space sector to the private parties so that they can also contribute to the India's growing competencies in space.
Mm-hmm. Is there a concern that if there is not a lot of desire or motivation from ISRO to look to the private sector, that stifles private sector development, right? If there is not a market for it, it won't grow, right?
Yes, in fact, I have come to know a number of different people who are youngsters, young engineers who have put in their own money to start the space startups, but not having found an enthusiastic response from the ISRO for close to a decade. Many of them have left for Europe or countries like Singapore, where they have, or even the US. Many of them have migrated in a sense, and they're like, okay, we'll come back to India maybe 10 years later when the environment is slightly better. There is more of a facilitating role that ISRO can play maybe by then. So a lot of countries are moving out, a lot of entities are moving out of the country because of their frustration with the ISRO for more than a decade. But the Prime Minister Modi and his finance minister have made a couple of bold announcements to say that the Indian private sector has to play a larger role, that they can use the ISRO facilities, that they can contribute in much bigger ways. But this is all big announcements, political announcements. These need to be converted to some certain amount of regulations. So those regulations we are yet to see, and I think that's what I'm waiting to see. But the ISRO is still looking at the private sector participation. The manner in which it is looking at is the outsourcing model. So ISRO decides that, okay, this is a capacity that we don't have in-house, so we are going to ask a private sector entity to develop it for us. I don't have the capacity to manufacture this particular satellite in-house within 3 months, so I'm going to ask somebody else to do it for me. So it is still a very outsourcing model. That is not a very effective or most effective way to incorporate private sector as an important stakeholder.
Mm-hmm. So then, are you concerned for the future of the private aerospace industry? You mentioned that there's almost this brain drain of people leaving to find other opportunities. But is this a bleak future for the private space industry in India?
Yeah, it is of some concern that the ISRO is still not opened up to the idea of giving space to the private sector to play an independent, an entirely sort of an independent role. And that could result in brain drain that we have seen in other sectors as well over the last several decades now. Best of the brains have gone to the US or other Western countries where there is if India has to be able to retain the talent or bring back some of the talent as China has done, for instance, it has to have a politically more favorable environment and intellectual freedom and intellectually as well as legally more favorable conditions so that some of this talent can be retained or even brought back to the country. So that is a bit of a concern that India is still not sort of embracing the private sector, because there is a huge talent out there. And if India is not able to take advantage of them and make the best for its own space program, it's a pity.
Mm-hmm. And a reminder, we are taking Q&A during the discussion. We'll save some time for the end to take some questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar to ask your questions for Raji. Let's turn to security. Another partnership that's more evident now more than ever is security in space. What are some of India's priorities when it comes to space security?
So let me just quickly start with India's traditional position and how that has changed. So India traditionally sort of opposed any militarization of space and argued that space must be used only for peaceful purposes. But this has been undergoing some change from early 2000s onwards and driven by the contemporary security threats in its own neighborhood, but also elsewhere. But I think what gave a big push to this change was the Chinese first successful ASAT test, anti-satellite test in January 2007. Since then, China has conducted many more ASAT tests. They call it by different names. They call it a missile defense test in order to avoid some of the international criticism. But I think this has given a big push because the Chinese ASAT test was a sort of a wake-up call to India, to the kind of threats that India has to be prepared to, in a sense. So that gave a big push. But I think going beyond the ASAT capabilities, China as well as other countries are developing a slew of other counter space capabilities, whether it is cyber and electronic warfare in space or directed energy weapons in space. And many of these have been in use, have been tested by China for sure, and also Russia in recent years. And over the last decade, China's use of cyber and electronic warfare have seen an uptick in a sense. So while China may be competing with the US as the primary competitors, primary peer, India cannot afford to sort of ignore some of these capabilities and how they might impact on India's own capabilities. In fact, that is what pushed India to develop and demonstrate its own anti-satellite capability in March 2019. The fact that India took a dozen years to respond to that, come up with its own kind of demonstrated capability, is a direct result of the kind of threats that are changing in its neighborhood. So when it comes to India's, so many have tended to question whether India has now sort of has completely left the issue of space militarization and weaponization, and is also on the path to weaponization. But the fact is that while India still continues to argue for, reiterate the point that space, it's still opposed to space militarization or now actually space weaponization, it has to develop its own deterrent capability given the kind of changing neighborhood, changing space security threats that we see. So following the Indian ASAT test in March 2019, the Indian Defense Research and Development Organization chief talked about India's plans to develop other counter space capabilities as well. India is also making some institutional changes. It's planning to develop its own aerospace command, its own version of the space command, so to say. But a prelude to that is another institutional setup called the Defense Space Agency, which is a tri-service institution that has come up in 2019. And India is planning to come up with its own kind of aerospace command in a few years' time. Meanwhile, India has also instituted another agency called the Defense Space Agency. Defense Space Agency. So there are a number of different institutional changes that are coming about, but also capability-wise, India is developing a number of different capabilities to keep up with the changes that we see in India's neighborhood and beyond.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned those ASAT tests. These are, when satellites are destroyed in orbit and they create, hundreds, if not thousands of pieces of debris. That was, in the headlines late last year when Russia conducted one that created debris that, threatened the International Space Station. There has been a lot of criticism for these ASAT demonstrations. How do you kind of, level that criticism with the need to display this defensive posture for if warfare does go to space?
Yeah, warfare, for all practical purposes, we can say that space is getting weaponized at a sort of a rapid pace with the kind of changes that we are seeing, with the kind of tests that China and Russia have been doing. Russia in particular has undertaken in recent years. So that is going to be driving many countries. So this is not just limited to India. Japan, for instance, is investing funds for developing its own interceptor capability. Australia is also thinking along these lines. France has developed a defense space strategy. Germany has its own version of a very small space force of its own now. So more and more countries are going to go down this path, and it's a dangerous, slippery slope, I would say. Mm-hmm. But what is required at this stage is that there has been a complete halt, literally a complete halt when it comes to multilateral discussions on space weaponization or any even broader space security threats. The fact that you have the Conference on Disarmament, the UN platform in Geneva that discusses space security and arms control issues, has been in a state of stalemate, for more than 2 decades now. And that talks to you loud and clear about the state of the multilateral negotiations and how slow we are. There have been a couple of other efforts to stem the current trends towards space in space security and in particular the space weaponization. So there have been a couple of GGs, for instance, the UN group of governmental experts. In 2013, you had the UN GGE on TCBMs, transparency and confidence building measures. I think, that at least that group managed to had some amount of agreement that finally managed to come up with a consensus report at the end of the process. In 2018-19, there was another UN group of governmental experts, GGE on PAROS, prevention of arms race in outer space. But the division and the deadlock among the key space players was such that the group did not produce a consensus report at the end of it. So that tells you again, loud and clear about the difficulties in multilateral negotiations and the failure of the ability to develop key consensus that is required for. So unless we get the multilateral negotiations on track, there is always going to be the suspicion, there is always going to be these kind of challenges that keep coming up, and more countries are going to be developing institutional measures, dedicated military space institutions, and also capabilities, counter space capabilities, because they are worried about what the other party might be doing. So unless we start investing in negotiations, dialogues, and discussions at the very least, and then come up with some useful technical measures to start with, I think we are on a slippery slope in a sense, because many of the norms that have prevailed for several decades have been recently broken. The norm to not test ASATs, anti-satellite capability. The last of the anti-satellite testing was done by the US in the mid-1980s, but both the US and the Soviets had decided that this is going to be destructive and let's not do that. But come 2007, China broke that unwritten moratorium, which brought back a new focus on ASAT testing. So 2008, the US had its own ASAT test, the Operation Burnt Frost. Then of course, 2019, India demonstrated its own capability. And I will not be surprised if there are, I can think about at least a couple of more countries that could go down this path if this current trend on space weaponization continues in a sense.
Mm-hmm. We're going to turn to our Q&A. So if you do have a question, please utilize the Zoom function to ask a question to our guest here. I'm going to start with one that has a little bit to do with what we were talking about. We talked about weaponizing of space and these ASAT tests, which create space debris. Space traffic and space debris management is a huge issue that's receiving a renewed focus now. We have a question that says, are there any interest in ISRO potentially leading on debris remediation strategies, as a critical area is solely lacking in international leadership currently? Could you see India running point on that?
Yeah, India is working with the in platforms such as the UN COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, which is based in Vienna. So they are already working with through the UN COPUS on the debris mitigation guidelines and so on and so forth. But again, that has had some limited success. But what more can be done? I think that is so. Can the international community think about and do something about placing a ban, working towards a ban on anti-satellite tests that result in so much of debris, in a sense, so much of additional debris than that's already there. I think especially following the Russian ASAT test, I think this has been something that has gained quite a bit of criticality, quite a bit of traction in recent years. So that is something that could possibly be taken up in the coming months and years, for instance. Within the UN General Assembly or somewhere or some of the other platforms, because the CD in Geneva has been in a state of limbo and nothing is going to happen there. So that's going to be, but I think the space traffic management and space debris, these are issues that need urgent attention if one has to be able to have continued safe and secure access to outer space, because otherwise space, we don't think about as to the usable orbits are limited in space, and unless we take measures to secure and engage in sustainable practices, we are not going to be able to use space for a very long time. But on the key question, whether the ISRO will take or India will take a key lead, I'm not sure of that. But I think what I can see is how India might partner with other countries such as the Quad or other kind of trilateral or minilateral initiatives, which can bring together at least the sort of a middle space powers who can engage in some of these kind of practical issues to deal with as a starting point, in a sense.
We'll take another question here, the question asker realizes this is a speculative question, but if you were to ask an average Indian citizen what is important about India's space program, what do you think that they would answer?
That's a good question. I think, no, of course, I think India's, the ISRO's ability to contribute to its overall communication and many such other requirements, I think that will always prop up. But I think what is, from a public perception, I think what is driving India or what is being most appreciated is also ISRO's ability to do this very cost-effective big missions such as Mangalyaan, the Mars mission, or Chandrayaan. These have really got the public attention. My apologies. So I think those aspects are something that is going to find a lot of traction among the larger population, in a sense. They may not go on to appreciate entirely what India's space program actually does in terms of communication or teleeducation, telemedicine, and kind of thing. But to them, I think what is particularly appealing is the fact that India is a developing country, but India has managed to catch up with a number of established developed countries who have had this Mangalyaan, other interplanetary missions, and so on and so forth. So I think that's going to be a lot more appealing. So there is a nationalistic kind of tendency also that come into play. Very proud of what India has been able to achieve from a public perception.
And we covered a lot during this conversation, Raja. So I'm going to give you this final question. What are you most excited about in the coming years? What are you personally looking forward to when it comes to space exploration and international cooperation?
Okay, a lot of good things happening, and but I'm particularly excited as well as eager to see some progress on space security governance related aspects, because I think the space security threats are becoming very, very acute. And I think that's something that we need to make some progress on. And in that regard, the recent UK proposal for space security governance does hold some very exciting prospects. They have gone on to establish an open-ended working group that will meet in 2022 and 23. That could make some traction, that could see some traction in the coming years. But again, the Ukraine crisis has come at the worst time, in a sense. The Russian invasion is going to change the political dynamics of any space security global governance effort. But I would really love to see some serious progress that we make on the space security front, space security governance front, because unless we do that, I think our ability to use space in an uninterrupted fashion is going to be seriously hampered.
Great. Well, Raji, thank you so much for this conversation. This was absolutely wonderful to chat with you. And thank you so much to the India Center at UCF for facilitating this. Lila, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brendan and Raji. This has been a really great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for the attendees for coming. If you guys would like to hear more about the India Center events, please join our mailing list, which is on our website. We have really interesting events coming up. We have a virtual discussion on US-India trade and also post-pandemic tourism in India, which will be next month. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much.